In your project boilerplate, you would have downloaded something like this. Now, you may have had a click around and seen a Sass file, component file, a module, and a main.typescript with some unknown names inside. So for this video, what we're actually going to do is focus on learning all of these fundamental basics that are inside this boilerplate so you can understand them before we move forward. Now, what I want you to actually do is highlight all of your code and simply delete it because we are going to start from scratch. So the first thing, now we've learned about imports and exports, is we need to actually import this thing called a component. Now, the component is a decorator. A decorator is essentially just a function that annotates a specific function. So in this case, we will be using the component decorator against a TypeScript class to tell Angular some specific metadata like our template and the selector of our element, because when we create components, we create custom elements. So we'll continue with this and we'll do from, and we'll do at Angular/core. So this is now imported the component decorator. So underneath, what we can do is simply do export and then class. So we can obviously import and export from the same file. Now our component is actually the class name. So here we're going to export a class called app component, which is essentially a class that we looked at in one of the previous videos. Optionally, we can create a constructor inside of here, and we could optionally do something like this.groceries equals an array like we did in the initial video. However, because we're using a TypeScript, we don't actually need to do this. So if I want to create something like this.groceries, I can actually just do groceries right on the actual component like this. And then we can say it's going to be a string array like we looked at in the first video. So for our component, all we're going to do is simply type the words title. Now title is going to be a string. Now we can optionally set the initial value up here. So we could do title Todd, but what we'll do is ultimate Angular. If we didn't want to actually set the static property up here, we could in fact create a constructor, and inside of here we can then reference this.title and we can assign it the value of ultimate Angular. So let's actually go ahead and remove this from here. So this is a nice way to actually develop, is actually declaring the type of the properties that you're using up here, and then we can simply use them inside of here. So now we've created a component, we can use this component that we've just imported from Angular. Now this goes above this export statement. So essentially the component is just a function. However, because it's a decorator, which is a TypeScript feature, all we need to do is simply prefix it with an at. So this is all we need to do to get our component actually registered with Angular to tell it that it is in fact a component. So essentially the component holds metadata for our particular component. In this case, it's the app component. So inside this decorator, we can create something called a selector. In the root project, we created app and then root. So the selector essentially creates the element in the HTML. Now, if we flick over to index.html, you can see we have app root. So all Angular projects have a base root component that then renders the entire application from. The next thing we need to do is actually assign a template to this particular component. There are two ways you can do this. We can use a template with an inline string. Now you can see here that I'm actually using backtick. So when I click over here, you can see that this is a backtick and not a normal string value here. So this is an ES6 feature that allows us to create multiple line strings with better readability. Now the first thing that we need to do is just inside of here, we can reference this title property because our component decorator essentially gets bound to this app component. All of these properties that we expose here, such as title, will then be available inside of here. So this is actually called interpolation, and we'll get onto this shortly in the video course. Now we've essentially understood what our component is. We've imported it from Angular's core. You can go onto the angular.io and check out the documentation to see where things actually come from, but essentially you'll be using component mostly. Component just decorates a particular class, the name of the component gets exported, and we'll work out in a minute how we actually register this with our module in the next video. So let's go ahead to the browser and actually check this out. So hopefully, if you've done that correctly, you should see the words Ultimate Angular in your browser. So now you've learned how to create your first Angular component using a TypeScript decorator. We've created a template in a string. However, we'll go back and show you two more things. You may have noticed that in the actual boilerplate itself, we had something called style and then URLs. Now, this array contains a reference to our Sass file. So here we can do app.component.scss, which is our Sass file. So this will essentially allow us to style a particular component. So let's say, for instance, we do background red. So now we've added this background red to this app class. What we need to do is go back to our component, and all we can do here is just simply add class and then equals app. So once we've done this, we can then save this out and go to the browser to actually see this change occur. So you can see here that we have Ultimate Angular in the gray and the background of the component is red. We don't have to create a template inline like this. We can actually use something called a template URL. And similarly, we would use this approach. So what we would actually do is just simply reference a particular file. So we can do / and then app.component and then .html. So Angular will actually pull this in for us if we want to split the actual template into its own file. I personally prefer this syntax because it allows you to look at this and your template at the same time and understand what's happening without switching between files. So this is the approach that we'll be taking for this course. We'll be using a template inline, but we'll also be using a style URL when we need to.